cho em tôi. Người đi trong đêm vắng, lòng mang gánh yêu thương, chân chân in cát trắng, vội vượt suối băng ngàn. Ai dã vờ im lặng, thầm tiễn biệt người đi. Bóng tôi vương đầy mắt, nhạt nhòa lệ ướt mi. Gió thì thầm sông núi, giọng ân tình nỉ non, lặng nhìn em lần cuối rồi cất bước ra đi. Gió lùa trên tóc rối, lạnh thấm đôi vai gầy. Mai này ai khoác áo giữ ấm cho em tôi. Người đi trong đêm vắng, lòng mang gánh yêu thương, chân chân in cát trắng, vội vượt suối băng ngàn. Ai dã vờ im lặng, thầm tiễn biệt người đi. Bóng tôi vương đầy mắt, nhạt nhòa lệ ướt mi. Đêm sương pha màu áo, tiếng sóng vỗ rì rào. Người qua dòng sinh tử, bỏ lại cõi chim bao. Đêm sương pha màu áo, tiếng sóng vỗ rì rào. Người qua dòng sinh tử, bỏ lại cõi chim bao.
Tôi nghe như vậy từ cung trời đau suốt, Đức Phật đản sanh để giải thoát muôn loài. Dưới cây vô ưu người thiện, trên dòng vua nước bay bước xưng tôn. Lâm tín đi vạn vật réo vui, các tỳ la hoàng cung vang rền. lên chiêng trống tưng bừng nghinh đón, hai từ đát đã ra đời. Tư đà nghiêng mình lệ rơi, bởi kiếm thân tướng hão tùy hình, mắt sáng ngời soi đường chân lý, xưng tôn nào giải thoát trầm luân. Bảy đóa sen nâng gót người xưa, đi kiến nào ai thể nhập ngàn sâu. Đấng từ bi con xin quy y người, Phật trong con đản sanh từ đây. Đã nghiêng mình lệ rơi, bởi kiếm thân tướng hão tùy hình, mắt sáng ngời soi đường chân lý, xưng tôn nào giải thoát trầm luân. Bảy đóa sen nâng gót người xưa, đi kiến nào ai thể nhập ngàn sâu. Đấng từ bi con xin quy y người, Phật trong con đản sanh từ đây. Hãy hát lên âm ca thiên thu, muôn lời ca từ nguồn tâm giải thoát. Hãy hát lên cho vang động sơn hà, bảy bước xưng tôn soi sáng trong ta. Hãy hát lên cho vang động sơn hà, bảy bước xưng tôn soi sáng trong ta. Giai điệu cổ vờn qua kẽ lá, vọng lời ru sao động trăng ngà. Cho duyên xưa tươi cười rạng rỡ, như người về từ cõi hoang sơ. Dệt nỗi nhớ thành trang tình sự, rải tơ lòng thành những vần thơ. Người nghiêng mình dâng vòng nguyệt quế, có hương huyền thơm ngát tình quê. Ánh trăng đêm huyền ảo soi sáng bầu trời cao, chứng minh đôi tình sự trao duyên ước ngọt. Tơ duyên trong mắt biếc đẹp như vầng cá dao, lắng sâu vào tâm thức thành khúc hát âu ơ. Giai điệu cổ vọng lên tam giới, động thiên hà, vang đến ngàn sao. Từ vô thủy một lời không nói, vẫn yêu người suốt cõi chiêm bao. Giai điệu cổ vờn qua kẽ lá, vọng lời ru sao động trăng ngà. Cho duyên xưa tươi cười rạng rỡ, như người về từ cõi hoang sơ. Dệt nỗi nhớ thành trang tình sự, rải tơ lòng thành những người nghiêng mình dâng vòng nguyệt quế, đó hương huyền thơm ngát tình quê. Ánh trăng đêm huyền ảo soi sáng bầu trời cao, chứng minh đôi tình sự trao duyên ước ngọt. Tơ duyên trong mắt biếc đẹp như vầng cá dao, lắng sâu vào tâm thức thành khúc hát âu ơ. Giai điệu cổ vọng lên tam giới, động thiên hà, vang đến ngàn sao. Từ vô thủy một lời không nói, vẫn yêu người suốt cõi chiêm bao. Từ vô thủy một lời không nói, vẫn yêu người suốt cõi chiêm bao. Ánh nắng một ngày sao trong thế, hoàng hôn sầm lối về, bao giờ tàn cõi mộng, đời sẽ đẹp đến thơ. Ai liêu xiêu rơi chiều pha tóc trắng, bỗng kiêu hùng còn lại gì không? Ai vật vã đớn đau quằn quại, lòng ta nghe quặn thắt đoạn trường. Xác người như lá úa, mặc tình lửa đốt thiêu, mới hoan ca không dứt. Giờ tang biệt đưa nhau, ai đi trong tĩnh lặng, đem thân về với tâm, dứt sạch hết phiền não, chân bước vượt ngàn phương. Anh liêu xiêu rơi chiều pha tóc trắng, mộng kiêu hùng còn lại gì không? Ai vật vã đớn đau quằn quại, lòng ta nghe quặn thắt đoạn chưa. Xác người như lá úa, mặc tình lửa đốt thiêu, mây hoan ca không dứt. Giờ tán biệt đưa nhau, ai đi trong tĩnh lặng, đem thân về với tâm, dứt sạch hết phiền não, chân bước vượt ngàn về đi thôi, hãy về đi thôi. Có gì vui kiếp sống chơi vơi, chưa ra ngoài ba cõi, sao có thể an vui. Chưa ra ngoài ba cõi, sao có thể an vui. Chưa ra ngoài ba cõi, sao có thể an vui. Chưa ra ngoài ba cõi, sao có thể an vui. Bao năm tháng hoài mong, nhớ thương lòng khắc khoải, mong được kính lễ người bậc đại hiếu thích ca, cung thịnh đức Như Lai, sáng thần lên đao lợi, mẹ người lòng khắc khoải, mong nghe pháp huyền vi.
So, welcome to Vesak 2650 International Tripitaka Recitation Ceremony that we just completed today. This is our lecture series, and John Freese is our very own professor here at Sakya Buddha University. So I'm going to read his bio. Reverend Dr. John Freese is a professor of Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist counseling at Sakya Buddha University. His research is focused on early Buddhist teachings and the Pali Canon and body-centered therapy. He draws from Taoist and early Hindu yogic teachings. He is a lay minister in the Dharma Vinaya order and previously trained as a Buddhist monk for 12 years with Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. And he has studied with other Buddhist and Hindu teachers in Europe and Asia. He went on to earn a Master of Divinity in Buddhist chaplaincy at University of the West and a PhD in practical theology focused on pastoral counseling from Claremont School of Theology. Then he has two books, the Four Modes of Knowledge Production, a Buddhist theoretical framework, and an anthology of 50 discourses from the Samyutta Nikaya. And he is about to publish another book called Buddhist ACT, or Acceptance Commitment Therapy, a Manual of Spiritual Care. So with great honor, I welcome my colleague, John Freese.
Thank you, Professor Victor. Venerable, respected Dharma friends. Thank you for this opportunity to share this evening. So this evening I'm presenting what is going to be the first chapter of my upcoming book, Buddhist ACT, a Manual of Spiritual Care. So the first chapter of the book is talking about the field of Buddhist spiritual care and how that relates to what I say is the need for schools of Dharma in America. So that's what I'll be discussing this evening. Okay, so what is Buddhist spiritual care? So that would include one-on-one counseling, group counseling, meditation classes, congregational ministry. So that would be, congregational is like a Christian word. You could say Sangha ministry instead of congregational ministry. Congregational ministry, which would include Dhamma talks, rituals, retreats. Basically, what you do at a temple running a Sangha, that would be congregational ministry. And then chaplaincy, so that would be ministers, monastic and lay ministers, doing chaplaincy work in such as hospital chaplaincy, so that would be healthcare chaplaincy. Or if you're a university chaplain, so that would be in the field of education. Or you have chaplains in the military, or you have chaplains that go to prisons. So Buddhist spiritual care then would be Buddhist ministers, which could mean lay or monastic ministers. So a minister means you're ordained as a minister, meaning you're a lay Dharma teacher or a monastic. And then you're offering spiritual care, and it's based on Buddhist theory and practice. Okay? So this field of spiritual care comes from Christian theology schools or schools of divinity. They have developed the field of spiritual care. And so within Buddhism, that field, the field of Buddhist spiritual care as an academic field hasn't yet been developed. So in America, you have Buddhist religious studies. That is a very well-developed field. Okay, so that would be scholars at universities that are studying Buddhism as an academic subject, meaning religious studies is the academic study of religion. So Buddhist religious studies is very well developed. Okay, Buddhist informed psychotherapy is also very well developed in America. So that means you have the field of Western psychotherapy that integrates mindfulness or other teachings from Buddhism into the Western psychotherapy. So you could say it's psychotherapy that is informed by Buddhism, but the main thing that it is psychotherapy. Okay? So that is also something very well developed in America. That's over the past few decades, that's been very well developed. Okay, but as I say, Buddhist spiritual care is still in its infancy. You can say it's still a baby. It has not grown up to be an adult yet. Okay, and then in addition, we can say the job market. So with Buddhist religious studies, you have a job market of professors teaching religious studies. So that job market is already there. Then with Buddhist informed psychotherapy, you have the job of being a psychotherapist. So that is a job market. It's already well developed. Okay, Buddhist spiritual care. So traditionally, of course, it is monks and nuns that offer spiritual care at Buddhist temples, at Buddhist monasteries. So traditionally, the job market for Buddhist spiritual care is you are a monk or a nun. So you make your living as a monk or a nun offering Buddhist spiritual care. Okay, so right now we can say in America, if you want to make a living providing Buddhist spiritual care, the main job market is that you become a Buddhist monk or a nun, and then that's how you're able to do it. So for lay ministers, there's not yet really a job market to do spiritual care as a lay person. Okay, then as I'm saying now in this lecture, the formal academic training for Buddhist spiritual care is undeveloped. So even if you are a monk or nun and you get training at a monastery or at a temple, you get the traditional training, you still don't have yet formal academic training to do the spiritual care. So that's something that still hasn't really been developed yet. Okay? Okay, so just to say a little bit more, what's the difference between religious studies and theology? So again, spiritual care traditionally is an academic field that is coming from Christian theology, okay? So that brings the question, what's the difference between religious studies and theology? Okay, so religious studies is traditionally in academia, meaning it's a traditional academic subject within the university system. So academia is just a fancy word for academic, the institution of academia, which would be universities and colleges. And so you have the traditional academic subjects, science, math, history, biology, psychology. These are all traditional subjects within academia. And then you have theology, which is not the same. It should be seen as a different category. Okay? So within academia, the worldview is mainly scientific materialism, meaning most of the academic fields are operating within the worldview of scientific materialism. And then what you're studying within academia, you're studying how do you apply it in a secular context, meaning if you study to become a doctor, then you apply that within a hospital as a doctor, right? If you study history, then you apply that as a history teacher at a university. Okay, so that would be secular application. And then when it comes to religious studies, traditionally, it's an outsider perspective, meaning somebody is studying the religion as a person who is outside of the religion, looking at it as an objective thing that you're studying, okay? So traditionally, religious studies, the scholars would be people that are studying religion, but they don't belong to the religion. They're studying it as someone who's outside of it. Okay? Over time, that's changed a little bit, but originally that is how it was done. Okay? So theology, of course, you have the pre-modern theology where you have the Catholic Church that had Catholic universities where they were studying theology. But then now you have the modern field of theology. And in America, you have Protestant theology schools. And so theology is a subject that is studied within universities. But theology as a field, it behaves differently. It's not the same as the rest of the academia. Okay? So it's a field of study that you can do at a university, but it's not exactly the same as the other academic fields. Okay? So traditionally, theology has a worldview that is recognizing rebirth. Okay? So of course, it's the Christian understanding of rebirth, which is very different from the Buddhist understanding. But still, you have to say, within Christianity, the belief when you die, you're going to be reborn. It's either going to be hell or heaven, or maybe purgatory, limbo in between for a little bit, but eventually you're going to be reborn either heaven or hell. Okay? Whereas in academia, the worldview of scientific materialism, when you die, that's it, game over, no rebirth, your consciousness stops. Okay? So within theology, it's not the same as the Buddhist rebirth, but at least it's some kind of rebirth. Okay? So that's unique compared to the other academic fields. Okay, then theology is studied to be applied within a religious congregation, meaning that you study theology in order to go back to the church to lead the church. Meaning someone studies theology and then they become a Christian priest, and then they go to a church and then they're leading the religious practice in the church. So they're part of a congregation or a sangha, and they're applying it within that setting. Okay? So again, it's not the same as a Buddhist sangha, but it is a religious sangha. You belong to the tradition, you're studying the tradition, and you belong to the tradition, and then you're studying it to apply it inside the tradition. Okay? Whereas, again, a religious studies professor, they study Buddhism, but they're not necessarily a member of a sangha and teaching it as a minister, as a Dharma teacher. So we can say then when you're studying theology, it's an insider perspective, meaning you're studying Christian teachings as someone who belongs to the tradition, meaning you're an insider inside the tradition. You're not an outsider. Okay? So, of course, Buddhism is unique because in some ways Buddhism is more like academia, and in other ways Buddhism still is a religion. It's still like theology. So I think one of the temptations has been for Buddhism to separate itself from Christianity, to say we are not Christians, we're more like science. There's kind of a peer pressure for Buddhism to distance ourselves from Christianity. But what I'm saying is that can come at a cost, because if you go too far into the academia, then you can run into things that don't necessarily go with Buddhism. Whereas if you keep some of what theology has, it kind of goes better with Buddhism. So what I'm saying is, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to saying what it is that makes us different from Christianity. We should still recognize, well, there's some good things in it that might be useful for us as Buddhists, that instead of reinventing the wheel, there might be certain things we want to keep. So that's what I say. We as Buddhists can learn from the Christian theology infrastructure, basically. Okay, so there are different types of theology schools. So sometimes they're called theology school, sometimes it's called divinity school. It basically means the same thing within the Christian world. They're both schools run by Christian denominations to train the leadership of the church and to study the tradition, you can say. Okay, so there's two different types. There's a theology school or a divinity school that's inside a university. So an example, Harvard Divinity School is the divinity school that's inside Harvard University. So you have Harvard University as the big umbrella. Harvard University has many different schools or colleges inside of it. And so one of them is the divinity school that's inside Harvard University, okay? Same thing with Yale Divinity School, Duke Divinity School, or University of Chicago Divinity School. Is that called? I don't know if University of Chicago. I'm not sure. Oh, it's one thing. Oh, it's closed. Okay, the University of Chicago Divinity School closed. I didn't know that. Professor Victor is telling me that school closed down. Okay, that is something that is happening. A number of theology schools are closing or downsizing. The ones that have been part of bigger universities have survived a little better, but what Professor Victor is telling us is even if you're inside one, you still might close. So Professor Victor is saying the University of Chicago Divinity School has actually closed. But anyway, the main point I'm making right now, that's one type is inside of a larger university, okay? Then you have standalone schools. So Claremont School of Theology, Fuller Theological Seminary, Princeton Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary, these are all standalone schools. I mean, obviously Princeton is related to Princeton University, so I'm not sure why AI gave this example, but these are standalone schools, okay? So here we are creating Sakya Buddha University. We know Master Huen Chao wants to have many different fields of study here at the university. So if we want to create a school of Dharma, that would be one school within a larger system. It would look more like this model over here, as opposed to having a standalone school of theology. Well, with this, you're limited to just studying, say in this case, the Dharma. You would not also have like a school of psychology or a school of law or a school of medicine. So that would be more like this model where you have a larger university and then inside of it, you have a school of theology or a divinity school. Okay, but one thing to bring up, Professor Victor initiated the idea, but in general, Protestant theology schools are having a tough time staying open, especially the more mainline liberal schools. Claremont School of Theology, where I got my PhD, they lost their campus in Claremont, and now they moved to a smaller, they're part of a church in West LA now. Their enrollment went way down, and they originally were a Methodist school, so they served Methodist churches, but the number of people going to Methodist churches has gone way down. And that's true all over America, the mainline Protestant denominations, the number of people going to church is going down a lot. So a lot of schools, they're having a hard time staying alive, basically is what I would say. Okay, that's kind of a side theme or a side piece of knowledge. But one thing you could say is Buddhism and the study of Buddhism and Buddhist universities it's a growing phenomenon in America. So we're on the way up, whereas theology schools are having a tough time. They're kind of on the way down. So we're kind of in a unique phase where one thing is building while another thing is going down. And what I'm saying is there's some things we can learn from the theology schools that are worth importing before they collapse, basically before they're gone. Okay, so what we have in the Protestant model, so the modern study of theology within Protestant Christianity, the prototype is the University of Berlin in the, I believe, I can't remember if it's late 1700s or early 1800s, but it's Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was a theologian. He was one of the co-founders of the University of Berlin. And the University of Berlin is seen as the first modern research university in Europe. And it became the model for other modern research universities in Europe. And so when the University of Berlin was founded, part of it was they had a school of theology within the University of Berlin, and Friedrich Schleiermacher was the person who was running the school of theology, and he was one of the co-founders of the University of Berlin. Okay, and so he created a way to study theology that had 3 divisions: systematic theology, historical theology, and practical theology. Originally, this is what it's called today, systematic theology. Originally, it was called philosophical theology. And so the systematic theology basically is studying the sacred texts and what is the meaning of the sacred texts. That's really what it gets down to. Okay, then historical theology means you're studying the history of the tradition. Okay, so within theology, that would be history of Christianity, basically, is what that would mean. Then practical theology means the practice of Christianity. So traditionally within theology, that would be you're training the priest how to be a priest. So how to give sermons, how to do pastoral counseling, how to do the liturgy, how to manage the church, all these kind of things that you need to know how to run the church. So practical theology would be dealing with all of that. Okay, so this became the model then for Protestant theology schools to have these 3 departments within the theology school. Okay, so you would have professors that are teaching in these 3 different subjects. Okay, then the main degree that is offered is the Master of Divinity degree. So that's the degree that you get if you want to become a priest. If you're going to be a priest in the Christian church, you go to a theology school and you do the Master of Divinity degree. So that's a 3-year degree where you take classes in all 3 of these subjects. And then that you get that degree, and then you also do other training within your denomination around becoming ordained as a priest. Okay, then for the professors that are teaching these subjects, then they would get PhDs in one of these subjects, and then they would be teaching at these schools. Okay, so they would be doing research on sacred texts, research on history of the tradition, research on practice of the tradition. Okay, now in America, we have the Association of Theological Schools. So this is an organization that sets the curriculum and the standards for the schools of theology that belong to the Association of Theological Schools. So all of these theology and divinity schools, they belong to the Association of Theological Schools. And the Association of Theological Schools provides accreditation to those schools. And so that's how they decide what are they going to teach, what are the standards that they're going to teach. Okay, normal universities have accreditation from WASC or the Higher Learning Commission. But theology and divinity schools, they have their own kind of separate accrediting body, you would say. Okay, so what we could say then, this is the infrastructure then for the Protestant theology schools in America. And so what I'm saying, what I'm arguing for is we should create a Buddhist version of that. Meaning, I think we should have schools of Dharma instead of schools of theology. And inside the school of Dharma, there should be these three departments. Systematic Dharma would be studying the sacred texts, meaning the sutras, the commentaries of the tradition. Then historical Dharma would be studying the history of the tradition. And then practical Dharma, of course, we're training people to be ministers, but for a Buddhist context, that would mean meditation, counseling, rituals, ethics, temple management, how to run the temple, or say if you're a lay Buddhist minister, how to have a counseling practice, how to operate a counseling practice, those kinds of things. So we can say one of the main differences then is within Buddhism, practice would mean Buddhist practice as far as meditation or say chanting or rituals, things like that. That would also be a big part of what we would do. Okay? So, of course, within Buddhism, we already have well-developed practice and we already have well-developed sacred texts. Then when it comes to the history of the tradition, we have the history of the tradition that we carry with us. But we can say, as a more historical academic study of the history of the tradition, that's still relatively undeveloped. In other words, within Buddhist religious studies, the history of Buddhism is actually not that well developed. There's some history, but it could be a lot more well developed. Especially like if you compared it to the history that's been done about the Christian church, it's not as well developed. So this is a major area that still needs to get focused on. Okay, and then so if we have a school of Dharma, we could have these three departments. And then instead of a Master of Divinity, we could have a Master of Dharma degree. So that could be a 3-year degree where you're studying these subjects, and then it's training you to be a minister. If you're a layperson or a monastic, it's training you to perform your functions as a minister. So this would be in addition to the regular requirements you would already have as a monastic who ordains within a lineage. That lineage has its own training that you would still have to do. If you're a lay minister, you would still need to be part of a sangha and a lineage. In other words, you would. This is one of the problems within Christianity. You don't want someone just their first time to learn about Buddhism is to come and get this degree and then go out and teach Buddhism. It's better if they're already part of a sangha and have a long time experience in the sangha, and then at a certain point they want to get more training. Then that's when you want someone to come do the Master of Dharma degree. So within Christianity, that's traditionally what happens. You're part of a church, you grow up in the church, and then at a certain point you feel called to be a minister, and then you go and get your Master of Divinity. But that doesn't mean that's the first time you're ever learning about the tradition. But anyway, so we could have a Master of Dharma degree, and then we can have PhDs in Dharma, which again would be people that are doing in-depth research in these three areas, and then they're teaching that within the schools of Dharma. And then we could create our own association of Dharmic schools, meaning we could have a network of schools of Dharma in which we create the standards and the curriculum we want to teach people. So if you're a Christian and you go to get a Master of Divinity degree, the requirements for that degree are set by the Association of Theological Schools. So each school is going to have their unique way of teaching, but they all have to meet the same set of requirements that's set by the Association of Theological Schools. And so one of the problems, we have Buddhist universities now in America that are teaching Master of Divinity degrees, but the curriculum is still, they're still operating, their starting place is still the Association of Theological School requirements. We don't yet have the Association of Dharmic Schools, in which you would have a whole different way of envisioning what should be done during that 3 years of training. So another problem is you have Buddhist Master of Divinity degrees, but the professors, their degree is either going to be in religious studies or Buddhist-informed psychotherapy or theology. That is who is teaching Buddhist Master of Divinity degrees, because we don't yet have a school of Dharma where the teachers would be having a degree in Dharma. So it's kind of like we're drawing from different things and kind of cobbling it together, as opposed to having our own infrastructure, our proper, we could say vertical integration of infrastructure. Okay, so now for me, my specialty is spiritual care, which would be part of practical Dharma, meaning counseling. Well, for me, it's my research is on meditation and counseling and how they go together. That's my focus for my research. And so what I have found is there are overlooked Buddhist teachings when it comes to Buddhist spiritual care. So again, the field of Buddhist spiritual care, it's still in its infancy. So what has been done so far, there's some important teachings that have been overlooked in terms of what is being taught for Buddhist spiritual care. Okay, so one is what I call the early Buddhist yogic teachings from the Buddha himself, using the Western dating system that the Buddha would be roughly 500 to 400 BC. And so my research has looked into the Samyutta Nikaya as being the early yogic teachings. And the core theory and practice would be the 12 links of dependent origination and the 16 exercises of mindfulness of breathing. So I have found for Buddhist counseling, these are two of the most important sets of teachings. But within the field of Buddhist spiritual care, these teachings have been neglected. Then in addition, I would say the Yogacara teachings on the 8 consciousnesses, which I see as a Buddhist psychology. It's a very advanced psychology. It's Buddhist, so it goes beyond the normal Western psychology, because the Western psychology is based on scientific materialism. It doesn't recognize rebirth and transcendent states of consciousness. So the Yogacara teachings already has a highly developed psychology that can function like a regular Western psychology, in addition to the deeper spiritual dimensions that we have within Buddhism. Okay, so Buddhist spiritual care in America hasn't really focused on the Yogacara teachings on the 8 consciousnesses, and I consider that also a vital teaching that should be part of teaching spiritual care and counseling. Okay, what has been focused on instead? Mainly the Theravada scholastic teachings and the Madhyamaka scholastic teachings. That has been the main focus so far within Buddhist spiritual care, as well as Western psychotherapy that is influenced by Buddhism. Okay, so that's mainly been the 4 establishments of mindfulness from the Satipatthana Sutta, the teachings on the 3 marks of existence, which is the teaching all conditioned phenomena are impermanent, suffering when attached to, and not self. And so that within Theravada Buddhism, the most developed form of that would be from the Visuddhimagga put forward by Buddhaghosa. And so it's been this teaching on the 4 establishments of mindfulness and 3 marks of existence. And that has mainly come into America through the Mahasi Sayadaw lineage of Vipassana meditation, as well as the Buddhist Publication Society. So the Mahasi Sayadaw Vipassana lineage, that's a Burmese Vipassana lineage, and that's been one of the most influential Vipassana lineages in America. And then the Buddhist Publication Society, that's Western scholar monks that were based in Sri Lanka and have translated the Pali Canon into English. And these 2 organizations are connected with each other. They have a lot of overlap between each other. So the Western focus on mindfulness and Vipassana meditation, the main source of that has been the Mahasi lineage and the Buddhist Publication Society. And again, it's mainly been the 4 establishments of mindfulness and the 3 marks of existence is the main teaching they've been putting across. Okay, then you have the Madhyamaka teachings, which of course are the famous teachings on emptiness and interdependence put forward by Nagarjuna, the great scholar monk from India. And so those have come into America through a few sources. One is the Gelugpa lineage from Tibetan Buddhism, which the Dalai Lama is the head of. Another is Thich Nhat Hanh, has his teachings on emptiness and interdependence have been very influential in America. And then there's what's called postmodern philosophy, which within Western academia is a very popular philosophy. It came from France. There's a famous philosopher named Foucault, and he was influenced by Nagarjuna and Buddhism. So it's like the teachings on emptiness, but it's put within Western philosophy instead of Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh also taught the Yogacara teachings on the 8 consciousnesses, but those teachings have not been focused on nearly as much as his teachings on emptiness and interdependence, as well as his teachings on mindfulness. Those have been much more popular, you could say. All right, so within Buddhist spiritual care and Western psychotherapy that is influenced by Buddhism, these are the main teachings that have been used. Okay, so why have these other teachings been overlooked? I would say there's a preference for scholastic teachings over yogic teachings, meaning teachings that are more philosophical. There's been a preference for that over more practical yogic teachings. There's a preference for, so I call existential humanist interpretation. That's a fancy way of saying teachings from Buddhism that you put inside of scientific materialism. So there has been a preference for teachings from Buddhism that you can stick inside of science. There has been a preference for that. Okay, so the Satipatthana Sutta, the teachings on the three marks of existence, and the teachings on emptiness, if you filter out the teachings on rebirth, they can fit within scientific materialism easily. So that's why there's been a preference for them, because those teachings, if you just ignore what the Buddha said about rebirth, these teachings can slide into science fairly easily. So that's one reason. That's arguably the main reason why they've been more popular. Whereas the teachings on the 12 links explicitly deals with rebirth, so that's much harder to fit within science. The 16 exercises deal with meditative absorptions, which I would also argue gets into the monastic precepts on celibacy as well. So the monastic precepts are supposed to be the foundation so that you can go into deeper meditation practice. And the precepts on celibacy, as well as not accumulating wealth, all of those things are what make your meditation practices much more powerful as a result. Okay, so within the Western culture in America, there are people that don't want to deal with rebirth, and they don't want to have to become a monk or a nun. So they don't want to deal with teachings that would make them have to think about that or do that. So I would argue the 12 links and the 16 exercises does make you have to think about that and deal with that. Therefore, they're not so popular within America. So what we can say, Western convert Buddhism, meaning people in America who convert to Buddhism, doing it, right? There's a very low amount of Western people that are monastics. The people in America that convert to Buddhism who it's not part of their ancestral tradition, the vast majority is lay people. Okay, so that gives you an idea then of why has there been a preference for certain teachings and a filtering out of other teachings. Okay, so then I explain this further. I have a theoretical framework I develop. I call it the 4 modes of knowledge production. And so this is a framework I developed to study the history of Buddhism and to teach about Buddhism. So there's been research on early Buddhism that has discovered that early Buddhism in Northeast India, the culture that was before Buddhism in that region was not Hinduism. So everybody normally has thought Buddhism came out of Hinduism, but research over the past 20 years has found in Northeast India, there was no Hinduism in that area, and that's the area where Buddhism originally developed. So what I say is it was probably some kind of shamanic religion or culture, and shamanic is just a general term. Like if you were to go to a Native American culture here in America before colonialism, it would be villages and their religion would be shamanic. If you were in Vietnam and you went into the mountains in Vietnam and you were in the indigenous villages, the religion there that was there even before Buddhism, that would be shamanic. Okay? So what I say is there's a shamanic mode of knowledge production, and that's what was in Northeast India before Buddhism. Okay, then you have yogic Buddhism, which is early Buddhism. Well, let me stick a little bit here with the shamanic first. Okay, so common elements in shamanic religion, you have rites of passage, meaning human being, the lifetime you're born, you go through puberty, you get initiated, then you get married, then you have procreation, then you get old, then you pass away. And then in many traditions, when you die, you go to an ancestor world. Okay? We see the ancestor altar right here on the side. Okay? So Buddhism has done a good job of integrating shamanic elements from the cultures it goes to. In Vietnam, you have the ancestor altar and you have the Buddha altar, right? So you could say that's the shamanic mode and I would say the yogic and the scholastic Buddhism. It's all fitting together very nicely. Okay, in addition, in shamanic religion, it's a common understanding your body is made of the 4 elements. So there's rituals and practices that are based on that, okay? So what I would say is that early Buddhism in Northeast India probably organically developed from an earlier shamanic base. Okay, so early Buddhism, you have the cosmology. So that's the understanding of rebirth and liberation from rebirth. The 12 links of dependent origination, it's describing the process of rebirth. And then you can be reborn into 3 different realms. And then eventually you can attain nirvana, and then you go beyond the rebirth. Okay, so that's the cosmology that is there. Then you have the yogic structure. So the 4 establishments of mindfulness, yes, that does give the yogic structure, meaning you have the body sensation, the heart, mind, and then you have Dhamma, which would be the deeper teaching on rebirth and liberation from rebirth. Okay, if you look at early Taoism, early Hinduism, they have similar yogic structure, they have similar cosmology. Okay, and then within the yogic structure, then you have a progression of practice. You work at the bottom and you go up to the top. Okay, so the 16 exercises of mindfulness of breathing, that's the progression that you use for the yogic structure. So the 4 establishments gives the structure, then the 16 exercises gives you the progression that you use to go through the structure. Okay, so you have similar process in Taoist internal alchemy, also in Hindu yoga, it's a similar setup. Okay, and then both the shamanic and the yogic modes are oral traditions, meaning the traditions are transmitted orally, it's before reading and writing. Okay, then later Buddhism, then I say is scholastic Buddhism. So now you get the more developed teachings into the nature of reality. So if you think of the Visuddhimagga and Buddhaghosa, or Nagarjuna and the teachings on emptiness, or Asanga and Vasubandhu, the teachings on the 8 consciousnesses, they are teaching about what is the nature of reality. And this is they're using reading and writing to transmit. Okay, then you have the academic mode of knowledge production. So you have modern forms of Buddhism that are drawing from the academic mode of knowledge production. The worldview tends to be the scientific materialist understanding of reality. You also have what's known as the humanities within Western academia, and it's also a written tradition. Okay, so the challenge, what we're facing in America is you have Western convert Buddhists that are using the academic mode of knowledge production. They're importing certain teachings from the scholastic layer of Buddhism, and then they're filtering out other teachings from the scholastic layer, and most of them just don't even know about the earlier yogic layer, and most of them still think Buddhism came out of Hinduism, and they really don't know anything about the shamanic layer either. So that is the danger we face, is if we get sucked into the Western academic study of Buddhism, we can miss out on what these earlier layers are. And so what I'm saying is we should use the modern academic layer as a tool to help us understand all four layers and have a properly integrated system. So just as a closing, some overlooked yogic teachings. There are certain lineages that tend to have yogic teachings within them. One of them is the Lady Sayadaw Vipassana lineage, which is a Burmese Vipassana lineage. And their main practice is mindfulness of the body as the four elements, and then mindfulness of body sensations as pleasant, unpleasant, neutral within the 12 links. Then you have the Ajahn Mun Thai Forest lineage, and they are focusing on the 12 links as well as the 16 exercises. Then you have the Yogacara scholastic teachings. One of the main modern sources is the Kagyu lineage from Tibetan Buddhism, which is headed by the Karmapa. And then, of course, Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings on the 8 consciousnesses. So these would be examples of lineages that are using the yogic teachings as well as the scholastic teachings from Buddhism. And so we can see those then as examples of traditions that are using those teachings. Okay, so these lineages have received a lot less attention than the Mahasi lineage and the Gelugpa lineage. Okay, so to conclude then, we need to build schools of Dharma that have systematic, historical, and practical Dharma as the departments. And as we said, this school of Dharma can be inside of a larger university. Okay, we need to establish Master of Dharma degrees and PhDs in Dharma. We need to create the Association of Dharmic Schools. And we need to develop psychotherapy-informed Buddhist spiritual care, not Buddhist-informed psychotherapy. What we already have is Buddhist-informed psychotherapy. We don't have psychotherapy-informed Buddhist spiritual care. And for Buddhist spiritual care, we need to focus on the early yogic teachings as well as the Yogacara teachings as two of the most important ingredients that would go into that. So it's up to Buddhist congregations in America to develop our own Buddhist infrastructure when it comes to the academic study and practice of Buddhism as Buddhists for Buddhists. Okay, so the book I have about to come out is on Buddhist ACT, so that's why I'm saying here Buddhist ACT. Acceptance commitment therapy is a mindfulness-based therapy developed by Stephen Hayes. So I've created a Buddhist version of it that I call Buddhist ACT. And so that's a model of Buddhist spiritual care that can serve as a chief cornerstone in building this infrastructure of Buddhist spiritual care in America. Meaning within a Master of Dharma degree, we can teach Buddhist ACT as content that can be used for Buddhist ministers to apply. Okay, thank you very much for your kind attention. Any questions or
Thank you,
comments?
John. Does anybody have questions? We have some time for questions. Yes.
Friend I have a friend who's watching on the
Online?
media
Yep.
platform online, and she has a question. Please ask Dr. Freese a question. Buddha himself came from Hindu family. Clearly, the influences from Hinduism are inevitable, at least to Buddha himself. Why he claimed Buddhism is not from or affected by Hinduism? That's his question.
Okay. Okay, so within the Pali Canon, we have the Sutta Pitaka, which is a very large collection of discourses. And inside the Sutta Pitaka, we have the 5 main Nikayas. And so in the Nikayas, yes, there are many discourses talking about the Buddha dealing with Brahmins, dealing with Hindu people, dealing with Hindu teachings, etc. But there's been some research that has said the Samyutta Nikaya might be earlier than the other Nikayas. And if you look at the core teachings in the Samyutta Nikaya, there is not that same level of interaction with the Brahmin culture. In addition, we have the research of Johannes Bronkhorst, who's an Indologist from the Netherlands. He passed away actually about a year or so ago. So he has the breakthrough research on the history of Buddhism. And so he is the one that has looked at ancient Hindu texts as well as archaeology, as well as Buddhist texts. His understanding of the Buddhist text is not as well developed. His understanding of the Hindu text is more developed, and his understanding of the history and archaeology is more developed. So his research has shown that Greater Magadha, so you have, within the time of the Buddha, you have the villages of Northeast India that are turning into cities. So you have Rajagraha and Savatthi are 2 of the main cities. So according to Johannes Bronkhorst, Greater Magadha, the core territory at the time of the Buddha, Savatthi, which is in the northwest, and then Rajagraha down in the southeast, that's the core territory of the Buddha. And so those 2 cities and the villages around them were not in the Hindu zone during the time of the Buddha. According to Bronkhorst, it's the territory east of the confluence of the Ganges and Yamuna River was not yet Hindu culture. Territory to the west, yes, you did have some Hindu culture. So the first urbanization of India was the Indus River Valley civilization, and that was what is now Pakistan, Indus River Valley, that area right there. So you had some cities, and they were engaged in trade along the coast with the Middle East and Africa. So there was a concentration of material resources and trade, and you had these cities develop. Then apparently there was some kind of climate change or some reason why they couldn't keep going, so those cities faded away. So that was the first urbanization of India. The second urbanization was in Northeast India along the Ganges River, and what Bronkhorst is saying is it was east of the confluence of the Yamuna and the Ganges River. So there were villages, and then cities came out of those villages. And he says, within the early written sources, the Hindu culture was not yet there. In the early writings, they would talk about it as a foreign territory that they didn't know much about. So what we could see is that the Hindu culture, the Vedic culture, was a culture that came into India in the northwest, and then they were in central India, northwest India, within villages. But then in northeast India, it was a different culture. So it was people living in villages. They were rice farmers. It was a different culture. And so then the Buddha came from that culture, and then Buddhism developed out of that culture. Then over time, that urban culture spread west. Greater Magadha spread to the west, and then it continued spreading all over India through the Mauryan civilization. So that's how the urbanization spread all over India. And so you had Buddhism, Jainism that started in Northeast India, then it spread all over the rest of India. Okay, so yes, then you did have the mixing of the Hindu and the Buddhist culture. And so yes, in the Pali Canon, yes, there are discourses where there's mixing going on, but I would argue that that would be later layers of discourses. So this is where it gets challenging, is when we are studying the history of Buddhism, we have the received history, meaning the history that we have received within the sacred texts that tell us the history of the tradition within the sacred texts. But then you also have the historical academic study of the history. And so those are two different things. And so Johannes Bronkhorst is studying the history of Buddhism. He's not just focusing on what the tradition is saying about itself. He's looking at other sources and archaeology, etc. So similar to, say, in the Bible, it says God created the world in 7 days, right? Okay, well, as science, we're like, no, that's not possible. So for us as Buddhists, we're not threatened by that, so it's not a big deal. We can accept, okay, yeah, that's probably not true, right? Okay, but within the Pali Canon, we have sutras of the Buddha talking to Hindu people or saying the Buddha came from a Hindu family. But that view there's a challenge to that view from the historical study of it. So now that creates a challenge. That's one of the challenges we have to face in having a university, is how do we reconcile these things?
So everyone, thank you, John, for this wonderful talk. Thank you. And because we are almost at time. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. And this brings our lecture series to a close. Thank you.
Người từ cõi tâm không về thăm chốn bụi hồng, vẫn thấy màu quá khứ ngập dưới ánh hoàng hôn, luân hồi từ vô thủy